Welcome to Reset the Algorithm. My guest today is Sara Wahedi. She is at the intersection of activism, entrepreneurship, and big tech. This is everything I love all in one place. Without further ado, let's reset the algorithm. Hi, welcome to Reset the Algorithm. I'm really excited about this show. As I've mentioned a couple of times, for me, since October 7th, I've actually been lucky. I've made more friends and met a lot of people. And one of those people that I met is Sara Wahedi. Wahedi. Tell me the pronunciation, the way that it's naturally pronounced. Let's first pronounce our name.
Wahedi is perfect.
Let's pronounce it American, and then let's pronounce it authentic. I'm Moj Madeira, authentically known as Moj Mahdara.
Oh, I love it. And I'm Sara Wahedi, and the proper pronunciation is Sara Wahedi.
Amazing, beautiful. And will you give a quick intro on yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Sara Wahedi, and I'm the CEO and founder of Afghanistan's first civic-tech startup called Ehtesab. And my mission through Ehtesab is to democratize access to information for everyone across the world, regardless of where they live and what they do. And I'm currently wrapping up my undergrad degree at Columbia, studying urban studies. And that's really my pitch. I'd say I also just focus a lot on the movement for the codification and entrenchment of gender apartheid in international law, and keeping the world focused on what's happening in Afghanistan, but also in Iran and so many other places where we are seeing gender apartheid unfold.
So apartheid comes from the Afrikaans word apart. The term was born out of apartheid in South Africa. It's system of institutionalized segregation based on racism and discrimination, with an aim to institute white supremacy. White supremacy. And that system eventually came to an end based on international pressures. So that came to end through severing diplomatic ties and instituting sanctions. Gender apartheid holds the same components of systematic segregation and subjugation, but against a gender group rather than a racial group. Let me give you some examples. Okay, so under the Taliban, the women of Afghanistan are banned from education, employment in NGOs, any governmental spaces, public spaces like parks, and even traveling long distances without a male guardian, all while having to abide by a severe dress code. Under the Islamic Republic in Iran, women are banned from many fields of study, sporting events, dancing and singing in public, even obtaining a passport or using it without their husband, father, or next of kin's permission, a man. Under that guise, a woman's testimony in a court is worth half of a man's. And they are, as you know, forced to wear compulsory hijab. These bans and the larger systems, legal systems that they belong to, seek to establish women's subjugation to men, but more importantly, the state, who's run by men. And in violation of these laws can lead to imprisonment, torture, and death. So, as you listen through your big Western ears, isn't this just discrimination? No, it's not. Let me help you. These systems are perpetuating a larger structural war against women for the purposes of dehumanizing, repressing, and entrenching power. What can we do about gender apartheid? A group of Iranian and Afghani activists, lawyers, and scholars have come together to create a global campaign that we can all support. This is their ask. Their ask is that legally around the world, we expand the understanding of apartheid to include gender apartheid. This would help women all over the world such that women have a legal pathway to push back on these laws, to remedy and hold people accountable for committing these crimes against women. And together we can prosecute those leaders who are enacting these atrocities. It would also make it clear internationally that we don't tolerate this behavior. You can make your voice heard on this issue by supporting the brilliant scholars, academics, and lawyers who have launched this campaign by going to endgenderapartheid.today and signing your name, letting them know that you support this effort. Let's get back to this chat with Sara. So, guys, this is hands down the reason why we started this show was with the deep desire to meet entrepreneurs, founders, thought leaders, and people that were bringing activism to the forefront of entrepreneurship. And Sara is the actual perfect example of this type of person that we have been yearning for as new futurists and new leaders in the world, and people that I believe are the right people to be doubling down on and betting on. And so we are both wildly passionate about bringing energy, attention, and ending ultimately gender apartheid in Iran and Afghanistan, and really throughout the world as a human rights issue, as a women's rights issue. Please tell us, and for everyone who doesn't know, I'm sure you've all heard of apps like Citizen, which a lot of people in the US use to find out about various different emergencies or weather, dysfunctions within infrastructure in the city, crime. Ehtesab is essentially Citizen in Afghanistan. When I first read about this, my mind was blown, and I just immediately sunk into how grateful I am. Someone like you could be building anything. You could be doing anything that you want. You're clearly an overachiever. You're clearly, your parents, I'm sure, are wildly proud of you. But you have chosen to build a business, to build technology that serves, in my mind, the most vulnerable, which is the women of Afghanistan, who honestly are so truly dependent on us and are voiceless in this moment. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and some things about the business side, and a little bit about how it looks like in real life in use.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I felt very legitimized in my work when you said that, Moj, so thank you so much. So how Ehtesab came about, uh, it's so funny to think about it now because I've talked about it so much, but I guess in the grand scheme of what's unfolding in Afghanistan, it feels like, I guess this was my destiny in some weird way. In 2018, in May, I was working as a policy aide in the president's office in Afghanistan. And I was walking home from work, and it kind of was like a normal thing to take taxis home or just to, take some sort of, I don't know, bulletproof car or something. I mean, I obviously was just a glorified assistant. I didn't have that kind of access to those kinds of services, but I made it an effort to walk through the city. I loved architecture. I loved urban spaces. So my thing was, as someone who grew up in Canada, which I'm sure we'll get into later on, I was always so fascinated about how Kabul just ticked. How do people live their everyday lives, especially at that time when we had, I mean, daily explosions. Like, this was not like the Kabul that you kind of hear now. I mean, this was missiles, rockets, suicide explosions on a daily basis. So anyway, I was walking home from work. It was March 8th, 2018, and I was maybe a block from my house, and I suddenly saw like a kind of a commotion in the street, and I kept hearing like this vest. And as I was just about to turn the corner, I just felt this like push of air, and I looked up, and I mean, with explosions, you see the light first, and then you hear the noise. And it was just this plume of smoke, and I just made a run for it. Like, I could just feel people pushing. I made a run for it. Got to my house, and I just kept watching this plume of smoke, three back-to-back explosions, just 50 yards away. Just, I mean, like watching from my balcony by the time that I got home, of just explosion after explosion after explosion. And about maybe 5 to 10 minutes into this situation, a friend of mine who worked at the U.S. Embassy sent me a text saying, Sarah, we just got an alert here at the embassy about some sort of explosion in downtown Kabul where I lived. But the thing was that my friend, she was like 10 miles away. And I was so stunned. I said, how do you know that? That's like, I'm literally watching it. I have no idea. And she said, we think that it's ISIS. We think that it's, in this specific location. Are you okay? And anyway, so that night passed, and it was 12 hours of back-to-back explosions. It was ISIS. They were attacking the Indian visa office in downtown Kabul, and I literally was watching like a movie, just ISIS soldiers and the Afghan army and police officers just basically throwing grenades at each other, shooting at each other, and it was an extremely traumatic moment. But the next morning, I asked her and I said, hey, how did you know that this was happening in real time? And she told me that the US Embassy provides these alerts to their staffers. And not just the US Embassy, the Canadian Embassy, the United Nations, they have this tool called INSO or UN Alerts. And these are basically text messages that are in real time. They have these informants on the ground across the city and across the country who just send them messages saying, hey, I'm in this area, I just watched this, disseminate this information to your clients. And I asked her, I said, well, is this available to Afghans? I mean, I live here. The suicide explosion, I saw it kill 6, 7 people. I mean, I almost died. I would have loved to have something like this. And she inquired and she said, no, this is only for people who are diplomats, people who work for the government, people who are, in these giant agencies. And it was like this fury just came over me. And I thought, you have these giant concrete walls, you have bulletproof cars, you have these big embassies. Why do you get to have all these services? And we're Afghans who have to walk through this city and every day. I mean, every Afghan has known someone, I think, who's lost a life or who's been hurt or has some sort of connection to suicide bombings or explosions or to the war. And it was like an obsession. I just spent the next few weeks just kind of drafting this idea of how would this platform look like for Afghans. And that was kind of like the moment that changed my life. And I kept thinking like accountability, transparency, these kind of buzzwords. And I took Ehtesab, which is also a Farsi word for accountability, kind of figured out how to make a brand new word, and we ended up with Ehtesab. Because another thing at the time was there's such an ethnic civil faction thing that's going on in Afghanistan with Pashtuns and Tajiks and all these things. I didn't want anyone to think that they had ownership over that word. I really wanted it to be its own thing. Like no group could say this is our language. It's like a completely fake word, and that was for a reason, so everyone could have ownership over what Ehtesab actually means. And we've been working every single day on this platform since March 8th, 2018, and it's now 2024. I think we've only been offline maybe like 2 or 3 times ever. Even on the day the Taliban came into Afghanistan, that company that I was telling you about, INSO UN Alerts, they shut down. The second the Taliban entered, they left, they shut down, and suddenly Ehtesab, which was run by like an average age of 24, now we became the security platform for the entire country. And we were basically helping, people in the US government, private companies, embassies get people out of the airport during those first few chaotic days. And, I mean, as experienced as we had become by then, suddenly we're like, these youth who are just like, oh my God, we have US officials who are contacting us being like, there's no information. Can you help us get people out? And that was a lot of, responsibility for us. But it just goes to show that a lot of this technology and a lot of these kinds of entrepreneurial endeavors, it has to be built by the local community. It has to be built by people who live there, who have ownership over those places. Because, UN Alerts and INSO, as fantastic as they weren't built by Afghans. They weren't built for Afghans. And that's why it easily shut down. I mean, they're back in business now. But, when the country collapsed, they left, and we didn't. I mean, we couldn't. It was our country. So, that's why I'm so passionate about civic tech or technology that's meant for the global South to be built in the global South. It shouldn't be this copy paste white savior complex of like, we can bring you this technology and we're going to save you. Because I watched it firsthand and it doesn't work. So, my mission really has been not just Ehtesab in Afghanistan, but supporting technologists in the global South to build their own solutions and not have to wait for someone in the West to come in and build it for them.
So I'm just going to pause here and say you're an incredibly generous human being. And the way that you talk about this without an ounce of bitterness or frustration or anger, I think is highly commendable. I don't think I could talk about this incident and this experience without feeling salty. So I'm going to be salty for you.
Thank you.
The United States government spent $2 trillion of taxpayer money, hundreds of thousands, and over the entire region, millions of people were killed, unalived, maimed. United States citizens died serving in the military, and we left Kabul. We left the women and the people of Afghanistan in a terrible, 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 terrible place, worse than when we found them. We did not achieve democracy. We did not achieve human rights. Um, and if you don't know about it, I highly recommend you watch this film, Kabul, which really shows the final 10 days, 2 weeks of what both the United States military was dealing with and getting out of there, but also what the people of that country were starting to have to cope with. And it's, I'm Iranian. Inside my soul, I burn every day, but through the work of gender apartheid and working with people around the gender apartheid, ending gender apartheid campaign, our brilliant, talented friend Gisunia, the women of Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan have I've fallen really in love with this predicament we're in, which is intersectional feminism and needing to step up and make a difference for these people. And so I just want to commend you first and foremost, because to create a technology of this magnitude with, I'm assuming, bootstrapped at first, is this I don't, was Elon Musk giving you zillions of dollars to start? Was this funded by Sequoia? Did someone just hand you $50 million? Or tell us about your... Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked this question, because sometimes I see these threads about me or comments where they're just she has all this money and there was a huge investment. That's the only way this is possible. But the interesting thing was when I was designing Ehtesab, I mean, like you mentioned, money was a big issue, because I was how am I going to build this and build it properly? And at the time, Afghanistan had one of the biggest tech companies called Netlinks, and they have been and still are in some ways the biggest tech company in the country, and they manage a lot of the military contracts for the country and a lot of that tech stuff. So I approached the CEO of Netlinks. His name is Farshid Riyasi, and he was always an innovative guy. I could tell that he'd been working on technology that was definitely very just forefront for Afghanistan. I mean, no one was thinking the way that he was. And I said, Farshid, there really is a problem with people being informed about what's happening. And I think the reason why a lot of Afghans have just stopped really taking responsibility over their cities, because they have no idea what's going on. And I think if we could figure out a way to not only keep people informed, but get them to send reports, get them to be involved, perhaps that could really assist with this kind of notion of citizen engagement. And that's how we know that a lot of people who are engaged in their citizenry or in their communities, they bring about change more than municipalities or states or whatever it is. And he said, okay, do an MVP, design something, pitch something to me, and let's see what we can do. And Farshid invested $40,000 American. And that 40,000 is how I've gotten here. I mean, we did a small campaign on the day that Afghanistan collapsed. I think we raised $35,000 because it was just so much work, and suddenly we're the only security platform in the country. So I think in total we're looking at about 75,000, and then probably from my own money through my own scholarships and whatever, maybe of my own money 10 to 15,000. So about 100,000, I guess, but that's it. For the last 6 years it's been 100K, and we're still online. We still have our staff, and it's so crazy when I think about it now, because so many projects have come to Afghanistan. We're going to build a municipality app. We're going to build this, city service app for $6 million, $7 million. And they fail. They fail constantly because they're brought in by these American or foreign contractors who are hey, we have this cool app from Venezuela. Let's bring it to Afghanistan. And they just, translate it from Spanish to Dari and Pashto. And they're I wonder why it failed. Because you don't understand the local context. You don't work with Afghans. You didn't understand what was happening. And whenever I tell people 100,000, that's it for 6 years. Most people don't believe me, but it just goes to show that a lot of technology doesn't cost a lot of money. It's really about the innovation and the design and the strategy. And we were able to build it for low cost, and it's a free service. And yeah, that's really been it. It's about 100,000.
So I have a zillion million questions. This is going to be such a hard session because I could literally, I have so many questions. Okay. So you were born in Kabul, you were born in Afghanistan, now you live in Canada, you are a diaspora child now, just like myself.
Yes.
How do you manage and reconcile these two realities? You are here and you are dealing with real life story. Look, and again, you're being very generous in this conversation, and I request that you actually talk about what the women of Afghanistan are dealing with as if you're talking to me or your friend the way you and I communicate. What is it? Why would you even care enough to build this technology? Why should someone care? What are these women dealing with?
You know, that's a great point. I think it's because probably you've observed me enough and you know the way that I tend to speak to the international community.
Well,
Underneath a lot of this,
Middle Eastern
yeah,
people are constantly faced with having to beg for Western energy and attention and dollars and contribution and exposure, and having to occur civilized and buttoned up and
yeah,
composed while we're watching our people. What? What is it?
exactly.
Tell yeah.
And the thing that really infuriates me is, and I've mentioned this before, is the world expects us to be so profound and so organized and so just so prim and proper about something that is literally hell on earth.
Tell
And I
us.
don't know and I don't know how to make people understand that. I was literally reading Laura Bush's address, 2001 November, and she addressed the United States people, the American people, and she said, you know, there's a terrorist regime that is destroying women's lives. Women cannot study. They're, you know, taking off they're literally cutting off women's nails because they're wearing nail polish. There's no music. Women can't go to school. We are literally living through deja vu. 20 years later, the exact same thing is happening again, verbatim.
I think
And
worse.
and worse
With with
because
with malice. Now with
with
malice.
malice and revenge.
Okay, the Taliban. Let's get into it. Okay, so they are Sunni Islamist nationalists. They are a pro-Pushtan group. They were founded in the early 1990s. They ruled most of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. The word Taliban is Pashto for students, describing the group's initial members. Composed of farmers and students studying Islam, primarily in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Taliban also went on to influence much of the fashion movement we saw over the next 20 years. So initially, the Taliban found a foothold in southern Afghanistan. They slowly worked their way up from the south through the north, swerving an S, and taking over provinces over regions that had previously backed by the Soviet-backed Afghan government. We're going to talk about the Cold War a little bit. That Soviet-backed government fell in 92. By 96, they had captured Kabul, killed the president, and they were basically in charge. They had basically, at that point, established the Afghani Emirates, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And true to form, their first thing that they do is institute Sharia law, a super strict interpretation of it. You've heard all this before because at this point, you know what they do. It's all about the women. It's all about the journalists. It's all about the academics. And you know there is no mercy on how they are treating these people. They were also coming for all of the, true to form, religious minorities, Shias. In the years leading up to 9/11, they, with warm, cozy arms, provided a safe haven to Al-Qaeda. So this was kind of like an Al-Qaeda resort base where they could freely recruit, train, and educate anyone that they wanted to recruit into their super Al-Qaeda terrorist club. And then they would export their terrorism to other countries because they're really generous like that. The Taliban was in charge up until October of 2001, at which point the United States government launched their war on terror. And then, of course, we were campaigning against Al-Qaeda. So, almost 20 years to the day, after $2 trillion, many, many lives lost, the war on terror was won by the Taliban. Yeah, that's what I'm fucking telling you. We left Kabul and all of Afghanistan to the Taliban. They regained power and reinstated all of their oppressive Sharia law. This is a brief video, but if you want to hear more about this or other extremist groups, we're down to do it. Just drop a comment down below. Let's get back to resetting the algorithm.
Because the day the Taliban came, I was talking to a couple of women who live in Afghanistan right now. They said the day that they came in and they saw us in the cafes, they saw us with boys, they saw us with our friends, they saw us, the Ministry of Women's Affairs in downtown Kabul. How dare they? You know, the Americans came in and what made them Western? And they came in with a force. And every Afghan woman knew that that was going to be the end. How could they? How could the Taliban come in and say, what? The Americans made Afghanistan so wonderful. I mean, you know, look at the women out just, you know, enjoying their... I mean, in terms of women's movement, I would say it was really, really up to par with Iran, which is crazy because, you know, you have 40 years of the Islamic regime, and then you have Afghanistan. But women were, you know, like I said, just, you know, owning cafes and going to school and having their businesses. We had, you know, you have the senior advisor to the president who's a woman. The UN ambassador to the Afghan ambassador to the UN was a woman. The day the Taliban came in, it was immediate. I mean, I had friends beaten. You know, they were throwing the guns into women's face, Kalashnikovs. Like, how could the world not see that this was going to become hell on earth? And there were so many of us ringing the alarm bell saying the Taliban has not changed. They will not change. I mean, when I saw the U.S. representative for Afghanistan shaking hands with the leader of the Taliban in Doha, I was shocked. I was shocked. Like, what information are they giving you? What precedent that they're going to actually keep women's rights or keep them protected or anything? I mean, what is there to really believe? It really felt like the Americans just wanted to wash their hands quickly and get rid of Afghanistan. That's what it really felt like, because they come in, we see images of the Taliban just face to face with this new generation of women, and these women are boldly standing up like, you can't tell me what to do. I mean, women did fight, and I hate when I see comments of, why are women fighting? Why are they at home? Did you see August 2021, September, October, November? Women were out in droves. The reason why they're not is because they were beaten. I mean, women were detained. They were tortured. Like, you know, the fact that we put in so much trust in the international community, in the freedoms that they believe in, and then for what? For Afghanistan now, you know, we're this kind of, you know, dystopic,
That's
you
right.
know, global South country where whatever, it's just Afghanistan. It's infuriating to me because, like I tweeted yesterday, $1 billion was spent on Afghan women from 2002 to 2020. You know, why? For what? Because now I've just interviewed 14 women for my thesis. Lawyers, urban planners, teachers, filmmakers who are just sitting at home for 3 years, literally detained, like just in detention in their homes. And it's astounding. Like, it is the most horrific thing that I think we'll remember in terms of our current time, because this wasn't a small incident within a small period of time. This was 20 years where we let these women grow, these girls, you know, probably 7, 8, 9 years old, to 20-year-old women in their 20s and 30s who became educated, independent, smart, who dreamed, and we just let them go. We just abandoned them. And as someone who had the privilege to grow up in the diaspora, the guilt is crippling. I feel so much guilt all the time because on the one hand, I feel, and I think you do as well, a responsibility to speak out. But you just wonder, I mean, it feels like we're at odds. Like, what do we really need to do to understand the depravity of what's happened? You know, we wouldn't be the way we are if we didn't have a chance to leave. And we're seeing 14 million women, like, you know, the gender part that we've spoken on many platforms, both you and I, is that this is an erasure. This is an erasure of women. This is not about, you know, just speaking about the loss of rights. This is erasure. We are not seeing women outside. When I speak to Afghan women right now, they're not in the markets. They're not in the streets. You don't see women in society anymore. And that's how we have to see it as. It's an erasure. And these women are at home. And if they're at home, there's no more support for domestic violence. There's no support for women's health care. I mean, if they're not only are they being erased, they're becoming mentally comatose. And it is, and I'm seeing it. I see the comments from women. I get their messages. Like, Sarah, all that there's left for me now is just to kill myself. You know, there's nothing left. And, you know, That's what the world needs to know. Is I'm tired, I'm sick and tired of talking about the golden age and the beautiful moments. That's gone. We don't have that anymore. And I think a lot of us in the West are really kind of clinging on to those beautiful moments, but they're not. They're sick and tired of us using it as a crutch. Like, what's next? What's the solution? And that's what we need to be talking about, not how it just was. I mean, how it is now. It's literally hell on earth in both Iran and Afghanistan.
People need to know that 2-month-old little girls are being sold into marriage.
Mm-hmm.
People need to know that 5-year-old girls are being sold into marriage. Americans need to know that kids are drinking battery acid to take their own life. Americans need to know that these women, when they're raped, they're put in jail. We have to take responsibility for this. We have to. And I feel like, sometimes people say to me like, man, it's so inspiring to see you, like what you're doing for, like Iran, gender apartheid. It's like, is it inspiring? Like, I'm 46 years old. Like, I lived most of my life not doing much for Iran, and I'm making up for lost time. I was born here. I'm privileged. I live the life of luxury as a queer Iranian. I am married to another Iranian. Both of my children are Iranian. My family is all in Iran. All of my extended family, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, everyone's there. And I almost so jealous when I go to like parks and picnics and I see like people with like these big families together and like big Thanksgivings and stuff. And I think about like my cousin who was recently just hung upside down for 14 days for having content on his phone from chains. And we're diaspora children. We're raised with these stories that are ultimately so different than the American public. But I think when we spend this kind of investment, when we put forward this promise and we leave people in such a terrible place, I think it's really high time that we have to, like, as an international community, we have to decide, are we going to be intersectional feminists? Are we going to stand for human rights? And if we're going to stand for human rights, are we going to empower and support and invest in revolutionary futurists like yourselves who are making a huge difference? Someone like you is possible to go back and become the next leader of Afghanistan. You are someone that is potentially the person that can build a bond for this country or build a diplomatic path for this country. And I think we have to stop, it's great that we have so many magazine feminists, but these are the real feminists. These are the real people doing the work. And I think this show and this team that we're, putting this show together, we're wildly passionate about helping our audience connect with people like yourself, because my belief about these extremisms is that they're contagious. And we'll talk a little bit about the current conflict, but I'm sure you and I were not surprised in the slightest on October 7th, right?
No.
You didn't sit up straight and say, oh my God, I can't believe. You thought, fuck, I was hoping that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And, especially with what's happened in Gaza, I remember when it was a weird time because I was in, I think, Ireland at the time, and we were talking about gender apartheid in Belfast at a couple of panels. And then the news on Gaza came out, and it suddenly became this huge movement of whataboutism about two groups who, talked about, well, if this is happening in Gaza, in Israel, well, that there seems to be a life that's more precious than the other. And I for a long time thought I'm just not going to share my opinion on it. But I think that as public figures, we have a responsibility to stop and urge people to think. And the way that I bring that up is there is no life more precious than another. Full stop. And I'm so tired of seeing campaigns on both sides about which life is more precious than another. That's full stop. What happened on August 7th was atrocious, inhumane in so many ways, and what's happening right now, an ongoing genocide that's happening in Gaza, is something that also can't be measured into which life is more worth than the other. And we saw that in Afghanistan, where after a while I had been, I kept updating the world on what was happening. We had a lot of women who had been imprisoned. I heard about one woman who was being tortured every single day. She was extremely ill and literally on her deathbed. And we were urging her to get out. And people were writing comments like, like the Taliban aren't so bad, and you're not focusing on what's happening in Gaza. And it was really startling for me because, I mean, the fact that we have now, beyond Israel and Palestine, now we have gone to a place where we are arguing whether the women in Gaza, the women in Iran, the women in Afghanistan, who should we be speaking about, who should have the arena, the public arena. It just goes to show that, number one, our attention spans are completely depleted, to the fact that we can actually compartmentalize humans into groups of who should we spend most of our time on, who should we be clicking and reading about. We have literally gamified humanity. We have gamified it, and we are watching it in real time, where we're having to just defend human life. And for me, it's so easy to sit down and say that every human on this earth deserves fundamental human rights, fundamental protections. And I'm at a crux as to how we got here. Like, how did we get here where we're actually able to debate whose life is more worth than the other? And that's something that we as humans need to sit with ourselves as to how did we get here? And that there's a huge lobby in place that relies on us to be divided.
That part. You know how much I hate lobby groups, and you know how much I hate. I rant about how much I hate these caste systems, these supremacy systems. There is a lot to unpack. I want to go back to, you're someone that's been called out by the Taliban. It's fair to say that you cannot go back to Afghanistan. You're not safe. Mm-hmm. Is your family safe going back? Probably not.
No.
While the Taliban was making their way into Kabul, you chose to delete all the photos of your staff members and information. How do you keep the people who work for you safe? How do you keep the customers that you serve safe? How are they, if they're hearing this, how do they know they're safe? Tell me.
So, one of the prices we pay for a citizen, for a lot of, the alerts you get on your phone on Apple when you get like the instant messages about the weather or any emergency alert, is what you're giving is your data. For that real-time, instant feedback, you're giving your data, you're giving your personal information. In Afghanistan, we don't do that. So when we have a gap, a lot of people talk to me about, why do you say the word near real time? And the reason why we say near real time alerts is because if I don't have access to that kind of data, I'm not going to be able to instantly send you something. For that, there's a give and take. And in Afghanistan, I would say when we have an alert, for example, like an explosion or something like that, we're seeing about a 15-minute delay. 10 to 15 minutes compared to, for example, if that were to happen through Citizen, it would probably be maybe like a minute or two, because we don't collect location, we don't collect names, we don't collect any biometric information whatsoever. When you register for Ehtesab, you just need an email. And the reason we need that is because for push notifications, you need to have some sort of connection to the phone. We don't do short codes. We don't have any sort of direct connection with your mobile. So it can be an email. So it can be a fake email. We sometimes get the most random emails. They're really never actual people's names. And that's to send that OTP, that login code. And the reason why we did that is because when I was building Ehtesab with my team, the first question was, how do we send the alerts but make sure we don't collect any biometric information? and it was email. It's unfortunately extremely slow, but that's the precaution we've had to make to keep our users safe. And if they want to write their number or their email for us to get information to them, if there's like a specific report about something in their district, if they want to share their number, they can. Most people don't share anything with us. So that's the first thing is email is how we keep our users safe. For my staff, we had an office, a really beautiful office in downtown Kabul. The day the Taliban came, they raided the whole office. So the second that they came, we saw the border because we were monitoring their encroachment into the city. The second they got into the border, I told my staff, go home right away. So they went home, they took their laptops, and from that day, they haven't returned. Some of the guys have returned, but none of the women. And they've been working from home through aliases. They all have different phone numbers. They use loaner phones. And we use a couple of encrypted end-to-end encryption platforms where we are able to discuss with each other about reports. And unfortunately, that's why my face is everywhere. I would love for people to meet my team. I would love for them to see the brains behind the people who are actually collecting the reports, but that's what we've had to do for their safety. And it's been heartbreaking. I try to help them leave. So if anyone is like, I have a scholarship, Sarah, I want to get out, I do help them. But whenever someone leaves from my team, I always make an effort to hire from within my country. I want to give the opportunity for young technologists to work on something like this. So whenever someone has the ability to leave Afghanistan, we always make sure that we're able to find someone else to cover their position when they leave. And then as for me, it's so interesting. I had like a Twitter troll harass me the other day when I had mentioned that I was essentially blacklisted from the Taliban. And he said something like, why would the Taliban ever want to touch you? And I just think about the women that they have problems with. They have a problem with the hijab. They have a problem with women going to school. And as a man, I was just thinking, why aren't you just taking a moment to pause and just understand who you're talking to? You're talking to someone who has publicly taken a stance against gender apartheid, against this de facto regime that I see as a terrorist entity. And the fact that if I land there, I mean, there's just, it's done. And we've seen that through a lot of the women activists who have been arrested. Regardless of any issues with my safety or not, I would never go back to Afghanistan, ever, while this terrorist regime is in power, because there are so many women in Afghanistan who would absolutely hate me. They would be so disappointed that I took my freedom, gave it up to return to a country where they would do anything to leave. They would do anything to leave, and it really angers me when the diaspora goes back. At this time, because I keep telling them, I get messages, Sarah, I want to go back to Afghanistan, I want to see. Why? There are girls out there who would take your passport willingly and leave and never come back. And 100%. I'm glad that you talked about the diaspora aspect, because within us, and I guess diaspora leaders or elders, and when I look down to the Gen Z kids, I think we have a fundamental responsibility to have those really difficult conversations as to what is it that makes us want to go back. Not just for like this kind of Iran or Afghanistan that we fantasize about, but when we know that a terrorist regime that is erasing 50% of the population is in power, what makes us want to go back? And what does that say about our privilege? And I've really wanted to have this conversation with our youth, that I find it extremely concerning that you're living in Canada, you're living in the US, and you're going to go to Iran or to Afghanistan for your summer holiday. Because I get messages all the time from women who screenshot me, friends or white women who go there for fun, for, voyeuring, and they're so angry. Like, I want to go to school. I want to go to work. I mean, she gets to go to work. Why is she here? Like, why is she legitimizing this entity? And it is a complex conversation because, like you said, we're from the diaspora. We've been lost from the time that we've been born in the West or grown up in the West, but we have to really understand the implications of what we're doing. And while we search for ourselves, what are the implications that we have on our home and to those who live there and who've never left there? And it's becoming a bigger issue because we're seeing, as the Taliban touts safety, we're so safe, there's no more bombs. I'm seeing an influx of diaspora return. And not only return, but also protect and defend them, which I find is just atrocious. Like it's there's such a lack of emotional intelligence there.
We are living in a we're living in like it's like a upside down Alfred Hitchcock Twilight Zone situation. You know, my DMs are filled with DMs of like white kids telling me Iran is not such a bad place. You know, how can I be so critical of the ally, you know, against the oppressor? That they are, you know, Palestine's greatest ally and hope, and that I'm not a friend of Palestine because I, you know, spend a good amount of my platform criticizing and bringing awareness to the hypocrisy, to the violence, to the extremism of Islamic Republic, Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. You know, these are not these places, these people, these countries. You know, contrary to you know, these kids in the streets here, these people are actually deserving of a better government than these people. They are actually deserving of better systems, better governance, better municipalities, better economic systems. Like if this is what you think that the people of Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and Iran and Gaza are, this is the best they can do, I really am offended by that concept and that belief. It wildly offends me. I feel, you know, really frustrated that either we're seen as like this oppressed people that, you know, can only ally with like the most extreme extremists of the on the planet, or we're the terrorist regime that's kind of like, you know, associated to like bad. It's like we're either incompetent and not worthy of anything better, or we're, you know, associated to like, you are not the Taliban, I am not the IRGC, you know, I'm not, you know, Hamas and Hezbollah and all these things. But it's like the binary thinking of where we are right now makes me want to, I can't stand it. It's, I see the 7th as a terrorist attack. I see Hamas as a terrorist group. I see the victims of the 7th as victims. You know, I don't think that that was resistance. I think what's happening in Gaza is collective punishment, unacceptable. It's a stain on America's history. It's disgusting. I have no support of that war, 0.0.0.0. And there was many ways to get rid of Hamas, and this was not the answer, you know? But also, why does Hamas even exist? You know, why are they even there? How did that happen? And so it's just, as Middle Eastern people, as MENA people, I feel like we're really stuck in this weird vortex of, I don't know where I belong. Am I the left? Am I the right? Like I've said this, I don't know where I belong. No one will actually even have me at this point, because I don't like think that I don't support screaming in the streets, down with America and long live Hamas. And I also don't support military solutions in the Middle East. And I think we have a track record of failing miserably at this strategy. And we have only created more terrorism because of our failed policies. I mean, it sounds like if they had just given you trillions of dollars throughout the Middle East, and you would have done a lot more to help the region. And we also shirk responsibility that we created the Taliban. We put the IRGC in power. The Islamic Republic is in power because of Jimmy Carter in the United States of America and the United Kingdom. We would not even be here. You and I would not even be here today. Stop. So somehow the people who create the problem seem to always do a great job of talking about all the things we're going to do, but the word accountability never seems to want to come off the tip of anyone's tongue. Why is that, you think?
I love that you brought that up, because just like people talk about, you know, where did Hamas come? Where did the IGRC come?
Well, no, because they all want to write us off as Islamic extremists, right? We're just, everyone's an extremist. So My question is, why weren't we extremists before the 70s?
Yeah, and I always remind people, like, where did the Taliban come from? The
Tell us.
Taliban were created
Taliban.
by the United States. Like,
Okay, so
again,
let's do that again.
yeah,
Taliban was created by, give us the
yeah.
whole spiel here.
Yeah, so the people think that the Taliban just kind of showed up out of nowhere. I mean, the Taliban were systematically provided weaponry against civil factions within Afghanistan because of Soviet encroachment, and they were terrified, and they found that this Talib regime and thought, okay, this will be like our new revolutionary group. And what happened, like it happens with many, is they spiral out of control. And those American Foreign Service officers who go and do the research about this is the group that we should be supporting don't understand that they have now created an absolute chaos. And that's what happened with the Taliban is they got out of control, and the United States was like, oh well, it's the better of two evils, whatever. We'll just go with this one. And suddenly they think that the American people have gone through so many waves of regimes in the Middle East that when we saw in 1991 this Afghan civil war to 1996, suddenly the Taliban are coming into power. And at the time, the U.S. was kind of like, let's just not talk about that. Let's not focus on that until when? 9/11. 9/11 made it inescapable for the American people to understand what was happening because they wanted accountability for lost American lives. And now they put the pin on the Taliban. And it's been so fascinating to watch, like I said, Laura Bush's address saying, we are saving the Afghan people because we've gotten rid of the Taliban, this terrorist regime that has destroyed women, that's murdering women in public, that's stopped them from going to school. And verbatim, the exact same thing like deja vu happened 20 years later. Like the American people need to sit with themselves as to how can a disaster like this occur? How can we implant regimes and allow them to create more violence, more instability? Because whether we like it or not, the Taliban and now growing ISIS-K or what's happening in Afghanistan, that's not going to stay in the country. That's going to. I mean, we saw what happened in Russia with the recent attacks by ISIS-K. I mean, these groups are getting stronger in one area. And now that we don't have boots on the ground, I mean, U.S. boots on the ground was always like a weird, complex thing. Like, were they really doing anything? But now we have a country where there is no one. You have a Talib-led country where terrorism is flourishing. Like, literally, just a few days ago, the supreme leader of the Taliban said, with force, with confidence, we will be flogging and murdering and torturing women in the public. And no one can stop us. Yeah, stoning to death.
Inside where?
In stadiums. Yeah.
Which stadium? FIFA? Which stadium? FIFA? Has FIFA come out made a statement on this yet? FIFA?
Yeah.
Huh.
And funded by FIFA, built by FIFA.
Wait, funded by FIFA, built by FIFA, now a stadium for stoning women to death. I just want everyone to like really get the world of what we're talking about while we hold the World Cup in Qatar.
Yeah.
Where Hamas is currently chilling.
And the binary, yeah.
They do not care about us. They just don't. And that's how extremism flourishes, because it's this othering. It's this funding Saddam Hussein. It's funding. They knew Yasser Arafat was going into Iran in 1978 with Ayatollah Khomeini to overthrow that regime. Like, that's not, like, the CIA knew that. That's, like, we have all that. We systematically hedge our bets in the Middle East by getting in business with bad actors. And in life, we've all learned the hard way that whenever you get in bed with a bad actor just like a little bit, it never stops at a little bit. It always becomes a fucking nightmare.
Yeah.
So now this entire region has become a blob, like just like a full blob of like Muslim Brotherhood meets Taliban meets ISIS meets ISIL meets Al Qaeda meets Islamic Republic meets Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthi. Like, it's like, what? Okay, so I panic attack about this all day long. I'm just like, fucking, what the fuck is gonna happen? What? What is going to happen? What do you think should happen right now? Like if you were in charge, like you're in charge, what's going to happen?
The beside all of this whole, like you had mentioned, like the Muslim Brotherhood meets the Taliban, beside that is all of the Western regimes that support these groups. So we have Russia, we have China, we have America, we have the United States, we have NATO, we have Saudi Arabia. I mean, this is just a front. And that's what we really forget, is that all these groups, all these factions are a front for what's happening at a global scale.
Okay.
And it's become insane because when people think about, for example, the Syrian war or what's happening in Gaza or anything, I mean, this isn't just one faction versus the other. I mean, like you had mentioned, the Taliban that we see now, or the IRGC, I mean, this is history upon history, like the palimpsest, just layer upon layer. That if honestly, I don't think I'd ever be good at like a kind of instantaneous leadership role where I'm like, okay, situation room, let's go. But what I would really focus on, and I would say that for the next generation, is we really need to be teaching our children about all of these different layers. And there needs to be some sort of United Nations for education about a universality in terms of the history that we're teaching, because a lot of the problems that I think that we're seeing in our current generation is disinformation and misinformation. These are the two things that are literally destroying the like our global society, is that it has become so easy to change fundamental truths. It's become so easy to change history that there was a time where most of us agreed about certain, moral goods and moral bads, and now we don't. Now we're able to distort everything, and I'm extremely concerned for the next generation, because if we're able to change truths, fundamental truths, what does that mean for fundamental human rights? There will be a day when the United Nations is going to become like a farce.
It already has.
Why do we? Yeah, it already has. It already has.
Red Cross a farce, Amnesty a farce, United Nations a farce. Like, I mean, every single I mean, the World Kitchen.
World Kitchen.
Kitchen. The World Kitchen is now debatable whether or not. I didn't even know what to post yesterday, except shame on us.
Yeah.
Truly, shame on us. Shame on us. Shame on us. Okay, so I study at a lot the role of the Islamic Republic now in Africa, South America. I kind of like look at this map. Sounds like you and I both look at Russia and China. Why don't people want to learn about the business of all of this? The trade, the oil, the minerals, the resources, the economic. This isn't just about a religious extremism. There's also another extremism going on at the same time. It's an economic extremism. It's a capitalism extremism. There's an extortion. I mean, Iran has lost, it's been overthrown by two regimes from both America and the British because of oil, because British petroleum started in Iran. They mined throughout the Middle East. They began in a place called Palestine. They then traded that land, the British then gave it, I believe, to the UN. And then from there, all of the history is debatable. But there's also economic extremism going on in this region and an exploitation of resources. From this perspective, it looks like we've agreed in our minds to dehumanize this region such that we have ample access to waterways and resources in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and getting oil in and out to Singapore so we can get it throughout the world. And what about the accountability for the economic extremism throughout this region, and how that shows up in the lens of humanity? Because sometimes I wonder if these facts are distorted to better serve like the financial needs we have.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I was just listening to an interview with the FTC chair. I think her name is Lena Khan. I'm not really sure about the U.S. system very much.
She was just on Jon Stewart, right?
Yeah. And she basically talked about this modern day feudalism, where a small pocket of these institutions have an exorbitant amount of power. And that's what's happening on a grand scale, not just in the United States. I mean, it's happening in China, it's happening in Russia. I mean, you're seeing it's happening in Canada. You have these giant conglomerates who control everything from groceries to oil to telecommunications. And, I, it's so interesting that we're focusing on something that is emotionally driven and requires a lot of emotional, that it's quite taxing to all of us. But what we're not seeing, like you said, is at the economic level a kind of game that's being played out, whether it's like, for example, what's happening in Yemen and the Suez Canal and so many things that it's impossible to sit down and just take a breath, because I don't know about you, but for me, whenever I think about the economic aspects, it is so interlaced, especially with globalization. I mean, the time that we were just talking about in terms of Palestine and British oil and these groups, I mean, this was not the globalization that we've seen post the 1990s. I mean, what we're seeing right now is unprecedented, and there's so many overlapping movements. For example, like the Belt and Road Initiative with China, and China now being in Africa and now working with the Taliban in terms of mining so many precious metals and
Yeah,
minerals.
right.
Yeah, in Afghanistan.
For this. It needs this.
Exactly.
This needs all those
Exactly.
things, and it's coming from somewhere.
Exactly. And
You know?
the fact that we're seeing these kinds of power brokerages is only going to lead to more instability. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but I've really loved seeing Lina Khan, the way that she leads the FTC and the way that she has been really trying to not force, but really just push Americans just take a moment to understand that, it's really lovely that we have, access to a lot of the technology and innovation that we have, but that's coming at a cost.
Yes.
And we need to
Listen,
be aware of what
the
that cost
answer
is.
the answer is Marie Kondo our lives. Like, I don't need a new phone every year,
Yeah.
right? I don't all the plastic from your shoes. What is that?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, it's just it's so tough, like, as a venture capitalist. And this is why I think technology is so amazing and interesting, because we can invest in next generation technologies that can help move these ideas forward. But I think we have to sit back and really reckon with, how did we get here? How the fuck did we get here? Because we have to acknowledge that we have created a human rights crisis. We've created a famine crisis. I mean, we're the most wealthy, economically robust the world's ever been, yet we've got multiple areas of the world breaking out in like human man-made famine.
It's unbelievable.
What the what the what is
Yeah.
that? How
Yeah.
how degenerate, like, how lame are we that we can't figure this out? And I think I've been thinking about this term a lot, like the GDP, but like, what's the GDE? It's like what's the empathy index? Like, it's just like in the shit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the global, like, right? Like, it's like we just have, like, we are bankrupt in that category.
Absolutely.
We don't care about each other. We
And
just don't.
but
But
it's
why?
yeah, and I even just think about myself and my attention span and the amount of information that I'm consuming, and the way that even our lives have been gamified in terms of social media, and how quickly now we're just swiping through. I think it was like an old mentor of mine or an old boss had said that he was testing us about, when you see an Instagram reel or something, how much time does it take before someone is like annoyed and just kind of tired and just keeps scrolling? And I think he said something like almost like a half a second, where if the content isn't suddenly just interesting or captivating, you're gonna scroll. Just 1.5 seconds. That is terrifying. If you need to learn about how you just talked about what's happening in Yemen, what's happening with the Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, you need more than 1.5 seconds to just sit there and understand what's happening. And a lot of us who work in spaces of activism or information sharing, all of us are trying to figure out now, how do we get people's information? How do we stop someone to say, hey, do you know what's happening in Iran? Do you know what's happening in Afghanistan? Do you know what's happening to the women of this world? They're literally being systematically erased. How can I fight for your attention? We have literally become corporate entities in our own way. We're trying to figure out, how do we get stakeholders' attention? And it's not about money. It's about, like you said, a complete just destruction and distortion of empathy. We're literally creating a corporatization of empathy. And I think the moment that happened, something changed in us, where where we realized that kindness and empathy can be commodified. And we're stuck on that now. Now we're stuck where the way that we're consuming just moral basics, just information about each other, is on platforms that are commodified. And what does that do to us as human beings? And I speak for myself that I feel like I don't know if I do have the capacity to care deeply and empathetically and intentionally about everything that's happening in the world, because there's so much. And I wonder whether that's on purpose, where we're just being ripped apart at the seams in every corner of this world. We even talked about South America. We even talked about Central America. We even talked about the refugee movements in that area. We even talked about so many other things. We even talked about climate change, environmental refugees. It's just so much. It's so much. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but that when we are paying attention to something, that it should be intentional, that we are giving the time to learn about this, like the binary that you talked about is so toxic, because every group that we support, there's so much history behind that. And like you said, people in your DMs are coming and saying, well, Iran is a supporter of the Palestinian movement. I mean, that's a huge statement to make, especially if you just don't take a moment to understand the history. And no Iranian would say that, whether they support the IRGC or not. No one would say that, because as Iranians, your history.
That's what's
better than
offensive,
anyone.
is having people not Iranian. Do I, as a human being, support the Palestinian people? Absolutely. Do I believe what's happening to them is unacceptable and that there's an injustice even before the 7th? Absolutely. But I do not believe for 1 second that Hamas cares about these people. There's nothing you can do to convince me that Hamas cares for the Palestinian people, because I know that the Islamic Republic doesn't care for the Iranian people. And it's the same. These are the same operating systems, right? They have different nuances, different versions of the operating system, but this is what that is. How does it feel? The other day, someone from my team sent me a video montage that like an IRGC proxy had made about me. And it was kind of like very spooky. It was a mashup of different speaking engagements and some tweets, and it was very like alarming to feel that, I'm on the radar,
Wow.
It's also known publicly that I'm very close to Secretary Clinton. It's known that I'm, friends and work with a lot of people within, congressional and Senate. And, I'm really proud of being like an active citizen. I feel like it's my obligation, not just for Iran, but I'm queer, I'm Iranian. I value my citizenship. I think America is amazing. I'm super proud to be like active in my government and in my community. I think it's something we all should do. But what does it feel like for you knowing that you are on a blacklist, a hit list, that you are on the Taliban's, list of people that they are not supportive of? What is that, putting yourself, your name, your family, eventually you might have a family of your own, I have children. Talk to me about what it feels like to put yourself in that harm's way.
I think because I always see myself as a technologist first, and also in the beginning, the first few years of the Taliban regime, I mean, if you go on Ehtesab's main page and you look at our map, we never actually write the word Taliban. So in terms of my role as a technologist, I've always tried to look at the problems of the country, in terms of a macro scale, because I believe that the Taliban is not going to exist for very long. I truly believe that. And because of that, I don't think in terms of, I guess, more impulsive emotions. I think about strategy. And for me, it's more, how do I build something that's going to last. And that's not going to just care about the politics of the time, because I truly believe, regardless of the previous, republic, which also wasn't that great, and the current, terrorist regime, my job is really to look at the macro and really look at the details. In terms of my personal stance as a woman, that's a completely different thing. I don't like when people kind of try to minimize my role as a founder, a CEO, or as a technologist because I'm a woman. It really bothers me when people say, you probably bring in some sort of emotionality or something, some feminism when you do your technology. And I'm like, would you ever ask Tim Cook that? It's a very weird question. Like, I don't really understand what that means. There is some, I think, in terms of design, having women in my team, being a female CEO, I think about the nuances in terms of the design and the safety of the application. I do think that that's something that I'm very blessed as a woman to bring into the platform. But in terms of myself as an Afghan woman, it was like undebatable for me. I mean, once they came into power, I was livid. I couldn't believe that, obviously I had the privilege to leave, but I think about my friends and my family and my colleagues who were these incredibly resilient, just powerhouse women who had led the country for 20 years, and suddenly just it was stripped from them. I felt a fundamental responsibility to speak out. And as heartbreaking as it is that I most likely can't return, I think about the fact that I never got to see my grandfather pass away. He passed away in June 2021. I haven't seen his grave. I wasn't able to go to his funeral. I think about my friend Sohrab, who was murdered by the Taliban. He was a Black Ops commando who surrendered on camera, and the Taliban shot him and his 22 his fellow commandos to death. And I think about the explosions. I think about the suicide bombings. I think about the hotels and the universities that the Taliban attacked, the people that were, there's so much loss that has come from this regime. There's so much death and so much horror and trauma, that it's not to say that I don't care about my safety. It's that there's a lot of people who rely on me to speak directly to this regime. And directly to the international community that is now deliberating whether they should be engaging with them. And I have the privilege to be able, as a technologist, I think, to see the nuances and to really hold these groups accountable. To say that you shook hands with the Talib regime in Doha, and you signed away the lives of Afghan women at that point. I will engage with you in a really, diplomatic manner, but I'm going to hold you accountable. And I know that I'm doing the right thing, because I do get messages from Afghan women, from Afghan girls who say, you have to keep going. You have to keep going. You cannot stop. Because if I had your chance, I would be screaming at the top of my lungs, please don't give up. And that's my job. I mean, I've been blessed, and you've been blessed to have this role. And I don't judge anyone based on their political beliefs or their stances, because I think engaged citizenry is a healthy democracy. Regardless of what position you take, healthy discussion like the one that we're having is only beneficial. Because regardless of who watches us, whatever stance they take, the fact that they get to listen to you and to me and to see our lived experiences and our connections, and that's what engaged citizenry means. It doesn't mean that we all have to agree. It means that we listen, and then we take that information and we figure out what connects to us. So I think it's a place of privilege to be able to speak, but unless they start learning how to poison people in America or something, I don't think I'm that in danger right now. I hope, God forbid, that never happens to me. But I just feel like I was given this responsibility, and I'm going to take it, and I'm going to go with it. So
I'm going to ask you one final question, which is, I get this DM, I don't know, at least 5-10 times a day. I don't read them all, but the ones I can, they're all kind of the same. It's funny how the past 6 months people just ask this, they say the same things, they ask the same question, and we can unpack that at another time. But people say, well, how are we supposed to get rid of terrorism? How do we get rid of terrorism, Moj? If we can't go and kill everyone and kill Hamas, and I call Hamas malware. I think of them as malware, like a virus on a system. There is no one to negotiate with. There is no solution. There is no resolution, because that's not the purpose of that particular operating system. That's just what I think. Not saying that's for all of groups, but this one group, you know, because people write, they're unreasonable. They don't want to make a deal. How do we get rid of terrorism? How do we get rid of the IRGC? How do we get rid of Taliban, ISIS? How do we get rid of terrorism?
That is a very loaded question. I mean, political strategy is not my forte, but I would say in terms of what's happening in Afghanistan, perhaps there are linkages with the IRGC and so many other terrorist factions, is, you know, I think the world needs to take the cases of Afghanistan, Iran, Palestine, Yemen, North Africa, so many, and just understand this type of new 21st century colonialism that's happened through statecraft and through terrorism, and just the atrocious state that the world is in when we encroach in other people's countries and in other people's systems. And we really need to have a conversation about what is our responsibility as a global citizenry, and where does our responsibility end in terms of involvement in other countries. And also in terms of the local Afghan community and in Afghanistan, I think that the United States made a grave mistake in terms of civil grassroots entities. I think they really struggled with figuring out in each province how to uplift communities and keep them protected, to be able to rise to the challenge of leading their communities and not having to rely on the Taliban. Because I've learned that, from studying citizen engagement and citizen technology, is that a healthy currency, or I see really a type of currency is a healthy society, a healthy communities as a form of currency, as a form of capitalistic endeavors. Is the reason why America, or from where I'm from, Canada, these societies can exist is because our democracy and our societies are healthy. We're able to have discussion. We're able to vote. We're able to. There's a lot of systems in place that allow these countries to flourish in a way that we're able to have a mosaic of different cultures, where you can live here and I can live here and people from all across the world can. But it's so odd to me that that kind of social currency is not expected or not valued in places like Iran, Afghanistan, or wherever it may be. That we don't need to be worrying about that thing. But for me, in terms of what I'm going to be investing my time in terms of Afghanistan, is I want to build back that social currency. I want people to take ownership over what's going to happen to my daughter if she doesn't go to school. What's going to happen to, my community if I don't just take a moment and feel a sense of responsibility of what's happening around me. Because whenever we disengage, that's when chaos flourishes. And I think that as in our local communities, that's what we really need to focus on, is how are we supporting engagement and responsibility of what's happening in our own circles. And that's, I think, what the answer is that collectivism, really focusing on ourselves, focusing on our communities. And that builds that resilience in terms of internal conflict as well. So I think we really need to get back to the basics and really get back to our local communities. And that's what I've been focusing on in Afghanistan. Is people are always asking me, like, well, what about like the country, and what about, this just the overall stance of what's happened with the Taliban? And I really believe it's something that's local. About why the Taliban, even before the Taliban, we've had a huge problem with families not allowing their daughters to go to school. This has also been something that's traditional within our culture. I mean, my mom, before the Taliban, during the Soviet regime, she wasn't allowed to go to school. That wasn't because of the Taliban. That was something intrinsic. That was something within, our fathers and brothers and uncles. So there's an intrinsic issue as well. And it takes patience and resilience, but a lot of trust in our local communities. And that's how I think we should be approaching something like terrorism and instability, is what's happening with our neighbors, what's happening beside us that we're overlooking, that's allowing something like this to flourish.
I think these are all brilliant ideas and strategies, and ones that I hope people think about. I think that the healthiest, most democratic countries in the world are countries that focus on human rights and inclusion of women. That's just a statistic that if people are looking
Absolutely.
to bring an end to terrorism, the fastest track to get there, Warren Buffett has spoken on this quite a bit, is that you focus on human rights for women. And countries that prioritize human rights for women generally have very healthy economic companies or countries. And I think to focus on human rights, the dividend that it will pay to society, if we focus on human rights for women, if we focus on ending gender apartheid, if we focus on these young women who are being sold into marriage and taking their own lives, the dividends will be that terrorism will have to fight to survive, because it will not be able to thrive in this cesspool of inequality. And the terrorism really thrives in environments where there is no human rights. And so when I look at the region, I look at the world, I look at our own country here, the rollback of women's rights here. I think people need to be, there's not just Islamic extremism, there's Christian, Messianic extremism. There's a lot of extremisms. And I
Oh,
think that,
I love that point. The last thing I want to bring up, because you brought up such a brilliant point, was I was talking to someone yesterday, and she was a director of psychology or psychiatry in New York for a while, and she said to me that she was recently in a Zoom call with mothers, Palestinian mothers and Israeli mothers on both sides, and they were in a Zoom call, and they had all of these psychologists and psychiatrists there to support them, and one of the things they said, if we could go back to the world and share some of your insights, what would it be? And both groups of women, Israeli and Palestinian, said, have more women in politics.
that's right.
Have more women leading. Have more women at the decision making table, and watch how the world changes.
Well, I mean, you see me post about it all the time. New
Yes.
leaders, futurists, get up, stand up. You are a futurist. I'm so grateful to you. I am praying for the safety of you, your family, everyone in your country, the women of your country.
Likewise.
You're grateful to you. I'm grateful to your ancestors. I'm grateful to whoever made you, that brought you forward to this planet. I learned from you. And I want to also just say, many people have lost friends since the 7th. I have made friends. And that's because I have gone out and I have asked questions. I have shared myself in ways that have often felt uncomfortable. I have reached out to learn, to be educated. I have changed my positions. I have changed my vernacular. I have amended a lot of the things I've said. And I just encourage everyone to stay curious and stay open and to reset their algorithm. Be omida azadi. I pray for you. I'm so grateful to you. I'm so flattered and just inspired by your work. It makes me want to go do so
Likewise.
many good things. And with that, amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Moj. You are an inspiration. You got to keep going, because I've been watching your platform, and I would say that you have done so much good in making people stop and think. So you got to keep going. This was made for you, and there's just so much more ahead. So keep doing this, because it's actually changing people's way of thinking, and in the most profound ways. So kudos to you.
Thank you.